Hey guys, Gaslight Studios here. And I'm starting this, hopefully, first episode in a new series called Belgian Battles. And today we're going to start with, this series is going to focus really not only on Belgian battles, but on battles that take place in the French province of Artois and Flanders, bits of Burgundy, basically the Low Countries of the French and Dutch-speaking Low Countries, with probably the exception of the Netherlands themselves, but that's a topic for another video. So, without further ado, let's go. August 26, 1914 will go down in history as possibly Britain's greatest defeat in the early part of the First World War. The first 3 months, I mean to say. The Battle of Mons had been fought less than a week before, and the British, despite being generally successful in that battle, had to pull back, thanks to the sheer weight of German numbers. General Horace Smith-Dorrien was commanding the rear guard, about 40,000 men in the second British Regular Army Corps. On the morning of the 26th of August, he decided to make a fight at Le Cateau, a small town about, I forget how many miles it is, but it's, I think, 30 to 40 miles from Mons. The entire smashing weight of the 6th, I forget if it's the 6th or I believe it's the 4th Corps of German infantry under General Befehlshaber Sicht von Armin, as well as the 2nd Cavalry Corps, smash into the British positions, and the encounter battle begins. Smith-Dorrien was acting basically on his own initiative. He had no idea what numbers he was going up against, but he believed that the longer he held, the better position the British and French would be in to check any future German advance. Armin was pretty ineffective at actually coordinating the battle. There is no evidence for his post-war for the official journal De Weltkrieg account that he was basically directing the entire battle. In fact, the 2nd Cavalry Corps of the Deutsches Heer was not operating under his orders at all, and the German army, by and large, was only operating at the divisional level. It wasn't even operating really in any other capacity. I believe only like 25% of the entire force was engaged. This was totally different from Mons. Mons had been a battle from which the Germans had taken enormous casualties from British rifle fire. The Germans had by now learnt their lesson. They were not going to launch massive frontal assaults against the British forward positions. The British, however, had yet to learn a critical lesson that would be taught to them quite brutally at Le Cateau, and that was artillery, or more specifically, how to manage artillery. The German army had some experience with field pieces. Their field pieces generally were pretty bad. However, the army was a professional and veteran army, and it was a lot larger. As such, they had a lot more cannons, or as we term them, guns. Most likely they were field pieces. The British made an incredible mistake at Le Cateau, which would cost them about 10,000 men total. Roughly 2,000 captured and 700 killed, while the rest were all wounded. And knowing surgery prior to, say, 2,000 for combat, it just isn't pleasant. So a lot of those guys probably were permanently incapacitated. But the British decided that they would hold all of their infantry in a sunken road, rather like Wellington did roughly about 99 years prior, a little over 99 years prior at the Battle of Waterloo. But they made a pretty bad mistake, because the sunken road was not at the top of the hill. The top of the hill on which they were positioned, the top of the sloping ridge that is so typical of northern France and Belgium and southern Belgium, sloped up. The sunken roads here sloped up and reached this small, maybe no more than 50 meters away, a small tree. The tree is a great landmark for the German artillery, and that's where actually the British positioned all their guns, were positioned across, giving them a clear line of fire over their men. But this was a mistake, because the Germans had by now learned the trade pretty effectively of indirect fire. They had observer teams who would go out and say, okay, that's X, Y, and Z. They'd send runners back, or they'd send a courier back saying, okay, this is where they are, this is where their guns are positioned, this is this quadrant here, their infantry are just over there. German losses in this battle were minimal, but the British suffered most of the damage from artillery. German losses, I believe, were about 2,500 compared to 7,500 British casualties. And most of those casualties were from the artillery. The Germans simply hid their guns really well, probably about a mile or so away, and just lobbed shell after shell after shell on the British. Thousands of British soldiers were wounded. As I mentioned, nearly 1,000 were killed. By nightfall, the British simply had enough. While the Second Corps did not crack, it certainly had taken a hell of a beating. It was quite a brutal affair, and Smith-Dorrien overnight decided to withdraw back towards Cambrai and Saint-Quentin. The way to Paris was now pretty much open, but the Germans were not going to capitalize on this, I believe, for another 2 or 3 days. They had taken a hell of a scare, both here and at Mons. They had not expected the British, first of all, to be at Mons, and second, they had not expected the British to put up that much of a fight. On the other hand, men like Smith-Dorrien and his commanding officer, whose name escapes me, the commander of the BEF, they had all had combat experience in India, whereas the majority of the German army officers, if they had had combat experience at all, would have been 40 years prior in the Franco-Prussian War, and very few of them had actually been combat experience. The British army was a professional army. It was not an army that, well, they didn't have conscription, and so they were not a force to be scared, but they had taken severe casualties, and they withdrew. And that is the story of the Battle of Le Cateau. I sourced a lot of this from Wikipedia. Also, there was a great documentary done by the late Richard Holmes about this battle, or more specifically about the whole Mons campaign. But this was fun, and I hope to be out a few more days with another video. Till then, ciao. Yeah, goodbye. Au revoir.